When it comes to religion and its traditions, it is clear that there are certain steps that one has to take in order to become a devout member. Whether these steps contain prayer, diet, or lifestyle changes, the person taking part in these rituals has to be disciplined and driven. When looking at the multiple cultures and multiple religions within the world, we could clearly see that there is a distinction in the way they carry on their lives. For instance, when thinking and talking about Christianity, the first image that pops into our heads is going to a chapel, like this chapel here. But what about different cultures? What about the different houses of worship, and the architecture seen within these houses of worship? What kind of role does the architecture play when it comes to the connection a person has with God? When analyzing different types of architecture, and more specifically Islamic architecture, it is important to understand and to grasp the religious beliefs and historical context before being able to deconstruct the iconography, composition, and purpose of a religious piece of art. According to theologian Houston Smith and his book, The World's Religions, Islam is in basic theological concepts identical with those of Judaism and Christianity. This means that Islam, Judaism, and Christianity are tied together by their core beliefs, but in one way they differ, and that is in their religious architecture. Islam is a religion based on very similar principles to Judaism and Christianity. Islam prides itself on its stronghold to monotheism. This is the belief that there is only one God, and that that same God oversees the entire world. This basic principle of monotheism then gets translated into Islamic architecture and art. Monotheism is also something that plays an important role in terms of what a Qubba and a prayer room looks like. Another belief that is embedded into Islam, according to The Economist, is that God speaks to man through language rather than through pictures or anything physical. Because Islam is a religion that tries to stay in line with its customs, omitting images is a big deal. Within the religious context, using images of either God or Muhammad, who is seen as God's prophet among Muslims, is to move away from the divine light and into idolatry. When it comes to understanding the basic structure of a Qubba, it is important to understand how they were erected. As Yasser Tabaa, a professor at New York University of Abu Dhabi, and his team were analyzing a Qubba in Marrakesh, he speaks about how the Qubba has a geometric property. This is based on the rotation of squares and the creation of the square root of 2. This is often a trope that can be seen carried throughout a variety of different Qubbas. The first Qubba of the two is located in the city of Granada, which is in Spain. This Qubba was constructed in between the years of 1354 and 1391 in the hall of Abencerras in the Palace of Lions. The Palace of Lions is significant to this Qubba because it is representative of two cultures that coexisted. According to BBC, in the year 711, the Muslim forces invaded the peninsula and 7 years later claimed it as their own. During the 1200s to the 1300s, it is important to note that the Caliph at the time established a state centered around the city of Granada. And although it is noted that the state suffered economically and politically, it flourished in terms of art, poetry, literature, and architecture. The Qubba, when looked at holistically, seems to have a simplified composition. This is due to the simple color and the basic 8-pointed geometric shape in the middle, encapsulated by a square border. When looking at this from floor level, it is easy to assume that there is nothing else to this Qubba, when in reality this Qubba actually descends further than first believed. Depending on the angle and the light that is given, the perceived dimensions of the Qubba shift. When seeing straight up, with low light, the Qubba seems to be mostly flat, with only some parts sticking out. but in reality, take a few steps back and the whole perspective change, the whole composition and the movement of the Qubba change. Being able to move back and also see the Qubba move leaves the viewer in awe when it comes down to it. The shifting in perspectives is helpful when it comes to adding architecture to a prayer room. It leaves people inspired and ready to take part in prayer. The second Qubba is part of the Mosque of Selim II. This Qubba is a parallel opposite to that of the Qubba seen in Spain. Due to the location of the Qubba, the composition and the color scheme are drastically different than that of the Qubba in the Palace of the Lions. This dome was constructed from 1568 to 1575 in Erdene, Turkey. The Ottoman architect of this dome was Sian, and he worked with Selim II. This architect was known to be one of the best of his time. Historically, from the 1500s to the 1900s, Turkey was under what was known as the Ottoman Empire. Because the Ottoman Empire had flourished so long, it could be assumed that they were an empire of great wealth and power. As a result of that wealth and power, the Mosque of Selim II was erected. When analyzing the structure of the Qubba specifically, it could easily be seen just how open it is. Instead of being confined to look like a square, this Qubba looks like an actual dome. Although the major difference between this Qubba and the one seen in the Palace of the Lions is openness, the color scheme and composition also differ. This Qubba creates so much movement within the ceiling. The geometric shapes and contrasting colors of blues and reds give the viewer a sense of wonder. Rather than being interpreted as intimidating, this Qubba vibrates with high energy and instead instills a sense of peace and calmness. The light source is also the complete opposite to that of the Qubba in Spain. These windows are large and create an arch. They have a larger surface area, which allows more heavily light to pass through without complication. The light and the warmer tones of the Qubba work well together. The warm colors add to the warmth of the light and therefore give the whole prayer room a sense of warmth. Although Qubbas are often seen as insignificant and aren't paid much attention, the Qubbas seen in Spain and in Turkey have left people in awe. Not only do they represent a historical and cultural impact on their locations, but they are also representative of how a different culture relates, and connects with God. Mosques were also seen as a natural expression of the society, according to Robert Hilburn, author of Islamic Architecture, Form, Function, and Meaning. And this is clearly seen when looking and analyzing both the Qubba in Spain and in Turkey. In Spain, there was constant turmoil and instability. Thus, the Qubba was made to look more intimidating, but on the other hand, the Qubba in Turkey was light, spacious, and grandiose, just like the culture it was surrounded by. In the end, both of these very distinct societies have left works of art for those who follow Islamic tradition and for those who don't, which have left us all in complete and utter awe of their work.